I am really excited about our first speaker today. We often have local speakers, and that's wonderful. We sometimes have statewide speakers, and that's wonderful as well. Our first speaker today is the Chief Deputy Majority Leader of the Connecticut Senate. He is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He is the senator from the 10th District of Connecticut, which is in New Haven. Please welcome to Justice Southbury, Gary Winfield.
Thank you. Listen, if you guys are out here at week 680, I will definitely be here that time, trust me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Juneteenth, a very important holiday. I want to first wish everybody a happy Pride Month, for the fathers, happy Father's Day, and for everybody, happy Juneteenth. We've been talking a lot about this holiday recently, right? A lot of people didn't even know there was a Juneteenth, and all of a sudden it's just, you can't get away from it. And I think that's great. What I think is really important is that we understand not only that there was a Juneteenth, but the context around Juneteenth. Because I think that gets lost a little bit in the discussions that we're having. And I think it's important, particularly here in the state of Connecticut, that we think about it because it relates to the way that people got free in this state, right? Some people don't even recognize that people were enslaved in the state of Connecticut. All right, I'll put it a little closer. But in Connecticut, when people became free, that happened gradually. A lot of people don't know that. It was actually called the Gradual Emancipation Act. All right, and so this passed, and in 1784 we passed the Gradual Emancipation Act, but in the year 1800 you still had people enslaved in the state of Connecticut. And so when we think about Juneteenth, a lot of people are offended at the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, and yet 2.5 years later you still had people enslaved. Think about Connecticut. 1784, and in 1800 you still had 1,000 plus people enslaved in this state. That's just like it's happened everywhere in this country. So we talk about Juneteenth and we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, but what we don't talk about, and part of the reason that I think is important for us to remind people, is that Texas wasn't the only place where slavery didn't come at midnight as the slaves sat there and waited, this concept of watch night. It didn't come at midnight freedom for everyone aside from Texas. There was a rolling, if you will, a gradual freedom coming to people who had been enslaved in this country across states. And I think you should also know that while we talk about Texas as the place where freedom finally came, even that's not the case. So when you think about the history of this country and what really happened, you should know that in Delaware, freedom didn't come until the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which was after June 19th, 1865. And it happened in other states as well. And even when freedom came, when the ratification of the 13th Amendment, freedom still hadn't come for everyone. Because we had people who were enslaved in the Choctaw communities who weren't free until there was a treaty with the United States of America. And so I think this is important because as we think about June 19th, it is important to think about a day that represents freedom, jubilee in the minds of some people. But it's also important to understand what it really meant. And then even beyond that, I think what's important is to think about, so when freedom came, what did freedom mean? Right? Because yes, people were celebrating, but what happened? That's not a great story, unfortunately. But it's important for us to know this story so that when we move forward, we know that we are moving forward understanding the past, so we move forward in the way that we should. And when freedom came, a lot of the formerly enslaved died because freedom wasn't free and here are the resources to live. Freedom wasn't you're free and let us make sure that you can prosper. Freedom was you're free. Right? And many of the people who became free didn't make it. 1 million plus people right after freedom came perished. And many others, they were in contract with the same people who had enslaved them so that they could make sure that those people still prospered. And then of course we have the 13th Amendment, which said that even though you've gotten free, here's a way to re-enslave you, right? And this is part of why we have a prison system designed the way that it's designed. right? And it is very important for us to know this history so that as we are celebrating Juneteenth, we are also remembering that at the root of almost everything in this country is the beginning of this country. The history we have of enslaving people and treating them as if they're not human beings. The history we have of doing differently than what your sign says, which is loving your neighbor. People always knew that what they were doing was wrong. We always had abolitionists, and certainly the slaves knew that it was wrong. But somehow we were able to persist in doing what we did. Somehow we were able to persist and look at the people who designed the systems around us and say it was fine. Well, I'm going to tell you what it means when you design systems as they were designed. It means that in 2022, you're having battles that people don't even recognize as connected to the beginning of our history. It means that in 2022, you're talking about Roe being overturned. And a lot of people will say, well, what does that have to do with the fact that we had slavery in this country? Well, the right in this country wasn't really paying attention to Roe versus Wade. It happened that they were fighting a different fight because they wanted to be able to segregate their institutions. And when the Brown versus Board of Education case came down and they lost the ability to segregate, they needed a way to organize those people. And you know where they turned to? Abortion. And so because we had slavery and the history that ensues from slavery that brings us to Brown versus the Board of Education, today we are fighting the fight in the way that we're fighting it. And I could go on and on and on. The point is, if we don't understand that history, then even the fights we're fighting today, we don't truly understand. And that, I think, is critical. And so I'm going to be celebrating Juneteenth, right? I have a flag in my window. I'm happy about it. But what I know that we need to know is that we have not treated our brothers, our sisters, our neighbors as if they are human beings, as if we should love them all. And I know, as the saying goes, that justice is what love looks like in public. And when we let those people become free, we did not love them. And so freedom and justice weren't connected. And the work that we have to do going forward, every single one of us, black, white, Asian, doesn't matter. Every American has to do the work of loving publicly. And that is the work of justice. So I'm very happy to have been able to come here today to spend a few minutes with you. Somebody asked me, was it a long drive? I'm not originally from Connecticut. There's no long drives in Connecticut. But it was, I know people think there are, but it was an important drive. Because that word, that understanding makes us all better. When we really understand what it is we're celebrating today. We're celebrating the notion that freedom came, but we have to remember that it came slowly, way too slowly, and why it came slowly. So thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Senator Winfield.